January 1945, the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The cold entered through the wound before the pain did. Captain Alfred Merker felt it first as numbness spreading through his right thigh, then as fire. White-hot, incomprehensible fire that made him understand why men scream. He did scream. The sound tore from his throat and disappeared into the gray winter sky above the Ardennes, swallowed by the thunder of American artillery that continued to rain down on what remained of his platoon's position near Bastogne. Blood pumped from his leg in rhythmic spurts, each pulse painting the snow beneath him in widening circles of crimson. He watched it happen with strange detachment, thinking, "This is what death looks like. This is the color of the end." His men tried to reach him. Through the haze of shock, Merker saw them, shadows moving through smoke and snow, calling his name. Then another barrage arrived, and the shadows scattered like leaves before wind. He was alone among the frozen dead, listening to his own heartbeat grow fainter, thinking of his wife Anna in their Munich apartment, of the yellow curtains she had sewn before he left, of the way morning light filtered through them onto their breakfast table. He would never see that light again. Of this, he was certain. 3 hours later, when consciousness returned in fragments, he understood he had been wrong about many things. The first wrongness was survival itself. Men did not survive wounds like his, not the shattering of the femoral artery, not the blood loss that left his uniform frozen to his body, not 3 hours in January. Snow at temperatures well below freezing. The medical texts he had read before the war were clear on this point. Yet here he was, moving, though not by his own power. Voices speaking English surrounded him, clipped, urgent, professional, American voices. Terror cut through the fog of morphine. He knew what happened to German officers in American captivity. The propaganda films had been explicit, the torture, the humiliation, the slow death that awaited those who fell into enemy hands. Better to have died in the snow, perhaps, than to face what came next. But hands, surprisingly gentle hands, were cutting away his uniform, exposing the wound. A voice, speaking German with an impossible accent, said close to his ear, "You're going to make it, soldier. Stay with us." Merker tried to focus on the face above him, young, maybe 25. An American medic with serious eyes and blood on his hands. Merker's blood, he realized. The medic was working with swift precision, applying pressure, calling for plasma. Another medic appeared, then another. 3 American soldiers were fighting to save his life. This makes no sense, Merker thought, and then thought nothing at all as they lifted him onto a stretcher. What Captain Alfred Merker could not see, lost as he was in waves of pain and confusion, was the journey that followed. 2 medics, Private First Class Robert Chen and Corporal James Mitchell, carried his stretcher across 400 meters of contested ground. They moved through a minefield that had claimed 2 men just that morning, each step a negotiation with death. When German machine gun fire opened up from a concealed position, Chen threw his body across Merker's, shielding the wounded enemy officer with his own flesh. Why? Merker would ask later, much later, when English came easier, and the question had form. Chen's answer was simple. You were wounded. You couldn't defend yourself. That made you my responsibility. At the field hospital, a collection of tents and mud barely 3 miles behind the front lines, Major Thomas Williams took one look at the wound and understood they were racing against time itself. The femoral artery was torn, not severed cleanly. Blood was still seeping into the thigh muscles, pooling in spaces it should never occupy. Sepsis would follow within hours. Death within a day. "Type O plasma now," Williams ordered. "Get me clamps, sutures, and someone find me better light. I can't see what I'm doing in this damn darkness." Around them the field hospital hummed with organized chaos. 73 casualties had arrived that day, 42 American, 31 German. All received the same triage, the same urgent assessment of need. Merker, delirious with pain, did not know that he had jumped ahead of 5 other wounded men, 3 of them Americans, because his wound was most immediately life-threatening. He did not know that the plasma flowing into his veins came from American donors, that the hands repairing his artery belonged to a surgeon who had not slept in 30 hours, that the chaplain holding his hand during the operation, the man speaking broken German, promising survival, had lost his own son to German artillery just 3 weeks earlier. He knew only pain and the strange impossibility of kindness in the mouth of hell. The second shock came during the operation itself, in that brief window of semi-consciousness before the anesthesia fully took hold. Merker heard Major Williams speaking to his assistants, explaining the procedure as he worked. The tone was clinical, almost educational, the same tone Merker remembered from his own university days, when professors would demonstrate techniques on cadavers. Except he was not a cadaver, he was the enemy. And yet Williams was saying, "See here, the artery's been torn, not severed. We need to clean the wound tract first, remove the debris. War wounds are always contaminated. Soil, fabric, bone fragments, all of it has to come out before we can repair the vessel." It was a teaching moment. Williams was using an enemy officer's body to instruct his team, but the instruction was delivered with such matter-of-fact respect, such absence of hatred, that Merker felt something inside him crack. Not physically, the morphine had dulled physical sensation to a distant throb, but somewhere deeper in the architecture of belief that had sustained him through 6 years of war. The propaganda had prepared him for torture disguised as medicine, for deliberate pain inflicted by vengeful victors, for the degradation that awaited those who fell into American hands. It had not prepared him for competence, for care, for a surgeon who worked with the same focused intensity whether the body beneath his hands wore German gray or American olive. "Penicillin," Williams said, and a nurse appeared with a syringe. "New antibiotic. We're using it on all deep wounds now. Cuts infection rates by 70%. 70%. An American nurse was injecting life-saving medicine into a German officer. The contradiction was so profound that Merker's mind simply refused to process it. He closed his eyes and let the darkness take him. When he woke again, he was clean. This was the third impossibility. Someone had washed the blood and mud from his body, had dressed him in a hospital gown, had placed him in a bed with white sheets. Not a cot, not straw on a concrete floor. A bed. The ward around him held perhaps 20 men. He could see American soldiers in some beds, German prisoners in others. A nurse moved between them. A woman, Merker realized with another shock of disorientation, checking pulses, adjusting IV lines, speaking in quiet tones. She stopped at his bed, smiled professionally, and said something in English he didn't understand. Then she checked his chart, examined the bandage on his thigh, and moved on. No different. She had treated him no differently than the American soldier in the next bed. Merker lay still, trying to understand the world he had entered, the world where enemy officers received plasma transfusions, where nurses smiled at prisoners, where surgeons used the latest medicine on men who had, hours earlier, been trying to kill their countrymen. In the bed to his left, a young German private, barely 18, with bandages covering half his face, was crying softly. An American soldier in the bed beyond, missing his left arm, called out in English. The nurse returned, spoke gently to both men, adjusted both their medications. Equal in pain, equal in care. This is not possible, Merker thought. Nothing I was taught prepared me for this. The journey across the Atlantic came 3 weeks later, when his condition had stabilized enough for transport. They moved him by ambulance to a port, then onto a hospital ship, the USS Consolation, painted white with enormous red crosses on its hull. The ship carried 470 patients, 230 Americans, 240 Germans and Italians. Merker spent the crossing in a ward with mixed nationalities. The man in the bunk above him was an American tank commander from Pennsylvania named Frank Morrison, who had lost both legs below the knee to a German mine. Morrison was learning to use prosthetics, practicing with parallel bars that had been set up in the ship's physical therapy room. He swore constantly, a creative stream of profanity that needed no translation, and made jokes that Merker couldn't fully understand, but recognized as humor by the laughter they generated from other patients. On the fourth day of the crossing, Morrison looked down from his bunk and said in slow, simple English, "You, German, name? Merker," he replied. "Alfred Merker." "Frank," Morrison said, pointing to himself. Then he made a gesture, thumb up, questioning. Merker understood. He tried to sit up, winced, managed to return the gesture. Thumb up. "I'm okay." Morrison nodded, satisfied, and returned to his book. It was such a small exchange, meaningless, perhaps, in the larger calculus of war. But for Merker it represented something unprecedented, the possibility of ordinary human interaction with the enemy. Not hatred, not fear. Just one wounded man acknowledging another. Later he would recognize this moment as the beginning of true transformation. Not the dramatic revelation on the operating table, but this quiet normalization of shared humanity. Morrison swearing at his prosthetics. An Italian prisoner teaching other patients a Neapolitan folk song. A corpsman distributing mail and treating a letter to a German prisoner with the same care as one addressed to an American sergeant. The ship became a world unto itself, a floating contradiction of everything Merker had been taught about American barbarity, Soviet cruelty, the necessity of total war. Here, medicine governed. Here, rank meant little beyond organizing care priorities. Here, nationality was merely another detail on a chart, less important than blood type or allergy status. Pennsylvania in February was colder than Belgium, but cleaner. The military hospital at Valley Forge occupied a former hotel, a sprawling complex with actual rooms, actual windows, actual heat. Merker was assigned to Ward 7, a unit specializing in vascular injuries. His surgeon, Colonel James Harrison, was 53 years old and had trained at Johns Hopkins before the war. He examined Merker's leg with professional interest during rounds. "Good work," Harrison said, studying the surgical repair. "Major Williams did excellent work under field conditions. The artery's healing well. You'll walk again, though you might have a limp." He said this in English, which Merker was beginning to understand, then repeated it in careful German. Then, and this was what Merker could never have anticipated, Harrison invited him to attend a medical consultation. "We have a case conference every Thursday," Harrison explained through an interpreter. "I think you might find it educational. You have medical training?" "Some," Merker admitted. "Before the war, I studied engineering, but I attended some anatomy lectures." "Good enough," Harrison said. "Thursday at 1400 hours. Ward 3 conference room." Thursday arrived. Merker hobbled to Ward 3 on crutches, accompanied by an MP who seemed more bored than vigilant. The conference room held perhaps 20 medical personnel, doctors, nurses, specialists. They were discussing a complex case, an American pilot with multiple shrapnel wounds and early signs of gas gangrene. Harrison saw Merker enter, nodded acknowledgement, and continued his presentation. He described the injury pattern, the surgical interventions attempted, the current treatment protocol. He showed X-rays, pointed out areas of concern, solicited opinions from other physicians. It was exactly like a university medical lecture, except the patient was dying, and these doctors were fighting to prevent it. Then Harrison did something extraordinary. He turned to Merker and asked, through the interpreter, "Captain Merker, you've seen combat wounds. In your experience, have German field hospitals encountered gas gangrene? What protocols do you use?" The room fell silent. 20 pairs of eyes turned to the German prisoner on crutches. Merker's first instinct was suspicion. This was a trick, surely. An attempt to extract military intelligence disguised as medical consultation. But Harrison's gaze was direct, genuinely curious, waiting for a professional response to a professional question. So Merker answered honestly. He described what he had seen in German field hospitals, the protocols they used, the success rates, or lack thereof. He mentioned a paper he had read by a German surgeon named Koch, who had experimented with aggressive debridement combined with oxygen therapy. Harrison listened intently, asked follow-up questions, thanked him for the input. Then he returned to the case discussion, as if consulting with enemy prisoners was the most natural thing in the world. After the conference, Harrison approached Merker directly. "Medicine knows no enemies," he said. There are only patients who need help and doctors trying to provide it. Politics is for politicians. Our job is healing. These words, delivered in a hospital conference room in Pennsylvania while snow fell outside and war continued an ocean away, completed the revolution in Alfred Merker's understanding. He had believed in many things before his wounding: the righteousness of Germany's cause, the degeneracy of its enemies, the necessity of total victory. These beliefs had sustained him through years of fighting, through watching friends die, through the grinding attrition of a war he no longer understood. But this practical humanism, this radical insistence that professional duty transcended national hatred, this was something new, something his propaganda had not prepared him to encounter, something his previous worldview could not accommodate. He returned to Ward 7 and lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the old certainties crumble like frost in morning sun. The months that followed became a graduate education in the architecture of American medicine. Merker observed with growing astonishment the systematic nature of care. Daily rounds where doctors explained treatment decisions to patients, all patients, regardless of nationality. Physical therapy sessions that pushed everyone equally hard toward recovery. A library cart that circulated through the wards, offering books in multiple languages. Chaplains who visited the bedsides of German prisoners with the same attention they gave to American wounded. He read permitted materials voraciously. Medical journals, newspapers, books on American history and political philosophy. He talked with other German prisoners, finding among them a similar cognitive dissonance. Many had expected death or degradation. All had found something more complex, not paradise certainly. This was still captivity, still punishment, still the bitter aftermath of defeat, but something that defied easy categorization. One evening, Merker found himself in conversation with Hauptmann Werner Dietrich, a former company commander who had lost an arm to American machine gun fire. They spoke in German, quietly, in a corner of the ward. "What are we supposed to think?" Dietrich asked. "They save our lives, then lock us up. They treat our wounds, then keep us prisoner. They show us respect, but we're still the enemy." "Maybe," Merker said slowly. "That's the point. Maybe we can be both. Enemy soldiers and human beings requiring care. Maybe those aren't contradictions." Dietrich shook his head. The Führer said Americans were weak, decadent, incapable of true strength. But this, he gestured at the ward around them, at the clean beds and professional care. This isn't weakness. This is something else. Something we weren't taught to recognize. Organization, Merker said, system. The belief that every life has value, not just the lives of the Volk. They actually believe what they say about human rights. They're not just propaganda words. It was a revelation that arrived slowly, built from accumulated observations. The discovery that penicillin was given to German prisoners and American soldiers in equal measure. That physical therapy helped both populations rebuild shattered limbs. That the kitchen staff calculated nutritional requirements for all patients based on medical need, not nationality. That when a German prisoner died despite all efforts, as happened twice during Merker's stay, he received the same respectful treatment, the same documentation, the same notification of his family that any American soldier would have received. This was system. This was civilization operating according to principles it actually held, not merely proclaimed. And the contrast with what Merker had witnessed in German hospitals, where Slavic prisoners received minimal care, where Jewish patients were often denied treatment entirely, where resources were allocated along racial hierarchies, was damning. He began to write in a notebook one of the nurses had given him. At first, just observations. Then questions. Then something approaching philosophy. True civilization is measured not by the power of armies, but by how society treats the defenseless. We measured our strength by conquest, by the submission of others, by the hierarchy of race. They measure theirs by the quality of care given to wounded enemies. Which is actually stronger? The war ended in May 1945. Merker heard the news in Ward 7, where patients, American and German alike, gathered around a radio to hear Eisenhower's announcement. Some Americans cheered. Some wept. The Germans sat silent, processing the magnitude of defeat. For Merker, the feeling was complex. Grief for Germany's destruction, relief that the killing had stopped, and something harder to name, a kind of shameful gratitude that he had been wounded when he was, that he had been captured by Americans rather than Russians, that he had survived to see this day at all. In June, Colonel Harrison called him to his office. "You're being repatriated," Harrison said. "The paperwork's been processed. You'll ship out next month." "To Germany," Merker said. It wasn't a question. "To Germany," Harrison confirmed. "To whatever's left of it." He paused, then added, "What will you do?" Merker had been thinking about this question for months. "Medicine," he said. "I'm going to study medicine." Harrison smiled, a small, approving smile. "Good. The world needs doctors more than it needs soldiers." He reached into his desk and withdrew an envelope. "I've written you a letter of reference. For the University of Munich Medical School, if it's still standing. It's in German. Use it if you can." Merker took the envelope with shaking hands. A letter of reference from an American colonel to help a former German officer enter medical school. The chain of impossibilities continued. "Why?" Merker asked. The question was inadequate, but it was all he had. Harrison considered for a moment. "Because I think you understand something now that you didn't understand before. Because I think you'll be the kind of doctor who remembers that politics ends at the bedside. Because we need men who've seen both sides of this horror to help build something better." He stood, extended his hand. "Good luck, Captain Merker." They shook hands, soldier to soldier, doctor to future doctor, former enemies who had discovered in a hospital ward in Pennsylvania that perhaps they had never truly been enemies at all. Alfred Merker returned to Germany in July 1945. Munich was a landscape of rubble. His apartment building still stood improbably amid surrounding destruction. Anna had survived the bombing, though she had aged a decade in his absence. They held each other in their damaged kitchen and wept for everything they had lost and everything they had somehow retained. In September, he enrolled in the medical faculty of Munich University. The campus was half destroyed, but classes continued in whatever buildings remained intact. He studied with desperate intensity, driven by something beyond ambition, a sense of debt, perhaps, or mission. The knowledge that he had been saved by men who followed a principle he now needed to embody. His classmates were mostly veterans, men and women who had seen war from various angles and now sought to build something from the ruins. Few spoke about the past directly. The shame was too fresh, the culpability too clear. But in quiet conversations over inadequate meals, Merker found others who had experienced similar revelations. A former Wehrmacht medic who had treated Russian prisoners and been shocked by their humanity. A woman who had worked in a military hospital and watched Allied bombing victims receive the same care as German soldiers. A former U-boat officer who had been rescued by British sailors who should have left him to drown. They were all seeking the same thing, a way to understand what they had been part of, and how to ensure it never happened again. Merker graduated in 1951 and began his surgical residency. He specialized in vascular surgery, a choice that surprised no one who knew his history. He became skilled at the delicate work of repairing damaged vessels, of restoring blood flow to dying tissue, of fighting the clock in operating theaters where every second mattered. And always he kept Major Williams's letter, the one he had never actually needed for admission, but treasured nonetheless. He kept it in his office, framed beside his medical license. On difficult days, and there were many, he would read it again, reminding himself of the principles it represented. The meeting in Geneva came in 1963 at an international medical conference on trauma surgery. Merker was presenting a paper on improved techniques for arterial repair when he saw in the audience a familiar face. Older now, grayer, but unmistakable. Major, now Professor, Thomas Williams from Harvard Medical School. After the presentation, they found each other in the conference hall. For a moment, they simply stood, two men confronting a shared history neither had expected to revisit. Then Williams smiled and extended his hand. "Your technique has improved since the Ardennes." Merker laughed, a surprised bark of laughter that dissolved 18 years of distance. I had a good teacher, even if the conditions were somewhat challenging. They went to dinner that evening along with several other surgeons and talked about medicine, about advances in antibiotic therapy, about the future of vascular surgery. They did not talk about the war directly, but it was there in the subtext of every conversation, in the unspoken acknowledgment of the journey that had brought them both to this table. Later, over coffee, Williams asked quietly, "Do you still have the letter? The one Harrison wrote?" "In my office." Framed. Williams nodded. "He died 5 years ago. Heart attack. He would have been pleased to know you kept it." "It changed my life," Merker said simply. "All of it. The surgery, the hospital, the conferences, the letter. You changed my life. I was prepared to die, and you insisted I live. I was prepared to hate, and you insisted on humanity." "We just did our jobs," Williams said, but his voice was thick with emotion. "No," Merker replied. "You did something harder than your jobs. You treated the enemy as if he deserved treatment. You saved lives that others would have considered disposable. You proved that civilization isn't about who you help. It's about refusing to withhold help from anyone." They parted as friends that evening, as colleagues who had shared something profound, who had participated in small acts of grace amid mechanized horror, who had chosen healing over hatred when hatred would have been easier. Alfred Merker spent the remainder of his life teaching surgery at Munich University. His students knew him as demanding, precise, and uncompromising about the ethics of medical practice. He was famous for a speech he gave every year to incoming surgical residents. "You will be tempted in your careers to distinguish between patients, between worthy and unworthy, between those who deserve your best effort and those who deserve less. You will be tempted by prejudice, by politics, by personal disgust. I am here to tell you that these temptations are the enemy of medicine. They are the enemy of civilization itself. Professional duty and humanity must be above any politics. This is not philosophy. This is survival." He told them his story, not dramatically, but factually. The wound in the Ardennes, the American medics who risked their lives, the surgeons who used precious resources on an enemy officer, the systematic care that had saved him and transformed him. "They didn't save me because I deserved it," he would conclude. "They saved me because I needed saving, and they had the capacity to do so. That is the only calculation that matters in medicine: need and capacity. Everything else is politics, and politics has no place in the operating theater." In 1968, he founded a charitable fund, the German-American Medical Fellowship, dedicated to providing care to war victims regardless of nationality or political affiliation. The fund operated in Vietnam and the Middle East and various African conflicts, always guided by the same principle: need and capacity. Nothing else. He returned to the United States twice more, once in 1972 for another medical conference, once in 1979 for a symposium on war trauma. On both occasions he visited Valley Forge, walking through the hospital where he had learned to be human again. The buildings had changed, the staff was different. But he stood in what had been Ward 7 and remembered Morrison swearing above him, remembered Harrison asking his opinion in the conference room, remembered the revolutionary ordinariness of being treated with dignity. Alfred Merker died in 1992 at the age of 73. His obituary in the Munich newspaper noted his distinguished career, his contributions to vascular surgery, his charitable work. It mentioned briefly his service in World War II and his wounding near Bastogne. It did not, could not, fully capture the transformation that had occurred in that field hospital, in that Pennsylvania ward, in those moments when enemy became patient and soldier became human being. How do you measure such transformations? How do you quantify the ripple effects of principled mercy? Perhaps you measure it in the hundreds of students Merker trained, carrying forward his insistence on humanity above politics. Perhaps in the thousands of patients treated by his charitable fund. Perhaps in the small acts of grace that occur when doctors remember that their primary obligation is to need, not nationality. Or perhaps you simply acknowledge that on a frozen January day in 1945, several American medics made a choice. They could have walked past the wounded German officer bleeding out in the snow. They could have provided minimal care and let nature take its course. They could have treated him as an enemy who deserved whatever suffering came his way. Instead, they carried him through a minefield. The rest followed from that choice. The surgery that violated no protocol, yet transcended routine duty. The hospital ward where nationality became merely another detail on a chart. The conference room invitation that treated an enemy officer as a colleague worthy of consultation. The letter of reference that helped build a future from the ruins of the past. These were not grand gestures. These were not dramatic acts of resistance against military authority. These were simply professionals doing their work according to principles they believed in, even when, especially when, those principles were inconvenient. This is what shocked Alfred Merker. Not the competence, though, that impressed him. Not the resources, though those were vast. But the absolute, unshakable conviction that suffering demanded response, that wounds required treatment, that humanity persisted even across the lines of war. He had been taught to expect barbarity and found systematic compassion. He had been taught to expect degradation and found respect. He had been taught that the enemy was less than human and found doctors who insisted that all humans deserve medical care. This was the lesson that saved his life and reshaped his soul. This was the mercy that defied war. And in the end, it proved stronger than the hatred that had wounded him, more durable than the propaganda that had shaped him, more transformative than the war that had nearly destroyed him. He carried it forward for 47 years, teaching by example that civilization begins not with grand declarations, but with small acts of principle, with the decision to treat the suffering regardless of who they are, to extend dignity regardless of politics, to insist that at the bedside we are all simply human beings in need of care. This is what those American medics gave him in the Ardennes. Not just life, but the possibility of a life worth living. Not just survival, but transformation. Not just mercy, but the proof that mercy, even in the depths of war, remains the truest measure of human civilization.